So I'm Laura, and don't know if you want to say hello, Orion.
Hi, Orion.
Sorry. So we're going to be running through early brain development and the parent-infant relationship today. We've only got 25 minutes for this presentation, so it's going to be a real summary. I'll pass over to you.
So we're going to begin with a broad definition of what is infant mental health. And in the first instance, one of my mantras is, it's not psychiatry for little people, but it certainly does span from the healthy normative through to clinical risk. So the brains of human infants are not fully developed at birth, with critical brain development ongoing during the first 2 years of life. Whilst this extrauterine brain development is genetically programmed, science shows that the quality of care provided by the primary caregiver, for example, attuned interactions, emotional regulation, and the provision of safety and comfort, is the greatest factor of influence. Infant mental health reflects infant well-being during the first 2 years of life, and the extent to which infant needs are met to support critical brain development. In turn, general health and development can be derailed in infants who experience neglect, harsh treatment, or repeated frightening experiences. And as I've said, infant mental health ranges from healthy normative through to clinical risk, and has the potential for lifelong consequences in all domains of health and development, for better and for worse. Thank you. Okay.
So we're going to watch the Growing an Emotional Brain video in parts throughout our presentation today, just as it links to the areas we're talking about. So this talks to early experiences and how they affect brain development with some lovely imagery. And I'll just allow Orion to show that video now.
Bear with me.
When we are born, our brain is bombarded with sensations and feelings, but has no idea what they are or where they come from. During the first few years of our lives, our brains develop so that we can identify these feelings as love or rage, fear or happiness. With this understanding, we can start to manage these intense emotions. This film is about how our brains develop in the formative years and how this development influences the way we deal with emotions throughout our lives.
Bad environment out-trumps everything. If you take a bunch of people with the best genes possible and give them the worst experiences, they'll come out much worse than people with the worst genes possible but really privileged backgrounds and very good parenting, for example. But these are complicated questions, and I think they'll become clearer in years to come. But what we do know is that genes don't rule everything. They have an effect, but their effect is determined by the kind of experiences we have.
A lot of people understand that early experience will have some impact on the kind of person that you are. But a lot of people may not appreciate as much that these early experiences are also built into your biology. So they actually shape the way you react to other people through your life. Understanding the neurobiology helps us to have a more accurate perception of what babies can and can't do and what they need.
Okay, so in order to understand how and why experience impacts so crucially on infant mental health and on long-term emotional and physical health, we need to appreciate the basics of early brain development in the context of environment. So the first 1,000 days of life is incredibly important for the formation of the architecture of the brain. As we saw in that video, these early experiences build the structure of the brain as neural connections grow stronger where experiences are repeated. So as you can see in the pictures, with the brain growing stronger connections to make sense of the world around them when babies are fed, for example, or when they see a dog. The hormone system is also affected by relationships, both before birth and particularly in the first few weeks of life. Some examples of hormones affected are oxytocin, the bonding hormone, and cortisol, the stress hormone. Humans have a social brain. This means that our brains don't exist in isolation. They are linked so closely to others. And for babies, this is usually with their primary carer. As soon as we are born, we are hardwired to interact with our primary caregiver, to seek proximity with them, and to seek face-to-face communication with eye contact. Even smiling is a reflex, cleverly designed to encourage the parent to enjoy time with and to care for their infant, forming that first attachment relationship. Our brains have a feeling brain, which is our body response to external stimuli, for example, butterflies in the stomach, and then the thinking brain, which allows us to plan or to think. This thinking brain is a social brain, and it's connected with others. For example, when a baby cries, which would be a feeling brain, they will hopefully have a caregiver who can use their thinking brain to work out what they need and to support them to feel okay again. This is known as co-regulation. And in the long term, the child is able to internalize this process and move on to some level of self-regulation. Although it's important to note that this takes years, we definitely cannot expect young children to self-regulate. Brain plasticity means development is genetically programmed, but shaped by environmental experience. This means it's never too late to change those connections. And whilst rewiring the brain may take more time and more repeated experiences at an older age, it is still possible. So we're now going to take a few minutes to watch the next part of the Growing an Emotional Brain video, which covers a few of these ideas.
Is that we're born with billions of neurons in our brain ready there, they're ready formed and ready to go, as it were. But what they don't have is any connections between them.
Towards the very end of pregnancy, the brain starts connecting up those neurons with what are called synapses, making links between the neurons. That continues in the postnatal period for about a year, 15 months maybe, of absolutely intense connecting up, which is the brain's way of reacting to all the stimuli that are around.
So if you look at a brain at birth, and you look at all the neurons, they're all there, but there's no links. If you look at a brain of a 3-year-old, loads and loads of connections are forming all over the place. At the same time, lots of neurons that aren't being used are what they call pruned. They die off. And the different kinds of experience we have will give rise to develop different kinds of brain pathways.
Experiences that are familiar and routine, that the baby experiences over and over again, the brain recognises these are going to be the most useful connections and the most useful pathways to keep. And the things that aren't used so much just dissolve away. So gradually the brain shapes itself into a very specific, unique brain to this person in their particular set of circumstances with their particular parents or caregivers.
The brain is an incredibly complex organ. Thinking more about its evolution helps us understand human behaviour and how we respond to our emotions and impulses.
In our evolutionary history, parts of our brain are pretty indistinguishable from a reptile's brain. Other parts of our brain are very similar to the brains of almost every other mammal. And other parts of our brains are quite unique to primates, and particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of us that helps rational thinking, that sort of thing.
The prefrontal part of that cortex really plays the biggest role in our social interactions, and it provides a platform in the mind, or in the brain even, where you can step back and look at your emotional reactions and start to exert some control over them.
In the first year or two, those parts, the more advanced parts, if you like, I'm going to use those sorts of terms, aren't online. They're not available for use very much.
And actually there was a very worrying study done in the States fairly recently which showed that I think it's as many as a quarter of parents thought that their babies should be able to control their emotions and should be able to control themselves, which is not only inappropriate, but literally their brain equipment isn't there to manage their emotions in that way. So, you can't really expect self-control until at least the age of 2, if then. Emotions are coming and going the whole time. Of course, in babyhood you need a lot of help in managing those ups and downs. And it's the parent's job to really pay attention to the subtleties of that up and down.
So I'm just going to run through with you a little bit of the hand model of the brain. And that was something that was come up with by Dan Siegel. And it's just helpful to help us remember the different parts of the brain and what they do. If you feel comfortable, I'd encourage you to have a go yourself. I know most of you got your cameras off, so yeah, hopefully that feels okay. So if you hold up your hand like so, in the hand model, your wrist represents the brain stem, or the reptilian part of the brain that they were mentioning in that video. So this is responsible for the real basics of survival, which is breathing, keeping the heart pumping, the nervous system, and it's the most primitive part, and it's the first to develop. Then just above this, where your thumb might be, if you fold it over, is the limbic system, or the mammalian brain. So this is the emotional part of the brain. It's responsible for our strong feelings like fear and anger, and it manages innate reactions like fight, flight, or freeze. And then if you look at your fingers and fold them over the top, this part represents the cerebral cortex, the thinking part of the brain. So it's responsible for processing information from all the other parts, for executive functions like planning, and it's also responsible for attachments. So these parts grow in order: the stem, the limbic system, and then the cortex. So young children, as we were saying, are still growing their cortex, which is their ability to plan, think, organise, and reflect. So their ability to do those things is very low to zero, really, in those early years. And this part keeps growing on until we're in our 20s. So babies are mostly working in their limbic system. So that's their fight or flight. And that's why they cry a lot. So when we calm our baby, we're helping them grow their limbic system through co-regulation. And now we're just going to have another part of the video. And this part is about better experiences leading to better flexibility.
These things that parents do without obviously knowing about the biochemistry are affecting the biochemistry.
Children who were brought up in the most depriving institutional orphanages, some of the most notorious ones in Eastern Europe, when their brains have been scanned, we've found that whole areas seem to have very little activity in them. If I'm sitting in a cot and no one ever comes, then whole parts of my brain are not going to be working in the same way. The connections aren't going to be forming, the neurons aren't going to be firing. There's a part of the brain called the corpus callosum, which links left and right brain. Left hemisphere is much more to do with cognition and thinking. Our right hemisphere might be much more to do with emotion. What we know is that certain people have a much thinner, less complex, less rich corpus callosum with less nerve endings in it as a result of the kind of experiences that they've had. So it's not just that some neurons die off through lack of use, but there's always lots of pathways. Some of us have richer, more connected brains than others. So more good experiences give rise to more complex brain systems, better connections between the different bits of the brain.
Looking at the brain in this way helps explain why some older children behave in particular ways.
One of the key things they'd find difficult as a result of early neglect or high levels of trauma is that they're likely to become less adaptive. In fact, even in utero, the fetus of a very depressed, anxious mother, when you give them a stimulus which might worry them, like a loud noise, they calm down more slowly. And we find the same with securely attached children. You give them a stressor, like the mother leaving the room. They're very anxious and they cry, but their mother comes back, they calm down really quickly. They also have much more flexibility. They go back to normal much more quickly. With many of the traumatised and abused kids we work with, they become much more inflexible and much more rigid, or they become incredibly chaotic and feel to handle very, very quickly. And so a neuroscientist like Daniel Siegel would argue that that's to do with the lack of good connections between the different parts of the brain. Flexibility comes with complexity, and rigidity or chaos comes with the lack of complexity.
That's it, Laura.
So currently we're in Infant Mental Health Awareness Week, and the theme is understanding early trauma. We know that early relational trauma, particularly if it's been cumulative, can have a really negative effect on neurobiological development. But let's look at the other side. What do babies need, and how can we best support them? So optimum care for infant mental health includes providing the infant with their basic needs, so making sure they are safe, meeting their physical needs, and that might be feeding or changing them, as well as the more relational aspects of loving and sensitive caregiving, and as well as providing consistent responses to their needs. And of course, we won't always be able to respond immediately and perfectly to our child's every need, but we often talk in the Parent Infant Mental Health Service, and I'm sure across our psychology services, about good enough care, which means responding as best as we can. And then when we slip up, like every parent does, it's about putting it right, which is rupture and repair. When the baby is dysregulated, the parent's job is to help them become regulated again, like the primary carer calming the baby after a late feed. When babies repeatedly experience adequate repair, this promotes the development of healthy brain architecture, resilience to stress, and in turn, it helps develop an internal working model of the primary carer being their safe base. So providing this good enough care allows little ones to develop good infant mental health, to become more flexible and resilient in coping because of their safety in their secure attachment. This will in turn aid their learning and development as they grow older. Okay, and I think now we've just got the very final part of the video that we're going to show you.
Yes, yeah.
People are often very worried that by stressing the importance of infancy, you're kind of saying everything's cast in stone, and if you miss out in infancy, you've had it, which really isn't the case. The brain is designed to adapt to reality, so it's constantly adapting and learning. Those connections that are made in that first year of life so rapidly and intensely continue to be made, just at a much slower rate. If circumstances change, or if we need to learn some new things, we can. Otherwise we'd really be done for, because we'd just be very rigid and stuck. So it's not a message of sort of doom in any way. It's just saying babyhood sets up your basic equipment. So that's the most kind of sensible, cost-effective and helpful time to get it right.
Babies are emotional beings. They are not able to recognize the sensations and feelings that can overwhelm them. Parents need to understand how intense and unmanageable these feelings can be and respond accordingly. Neuroscientific research suggests that the way parents interact with their babies affects their brain development. Supporting parents so they can provide a secure emotional environment will affect their babies in a deep and profound way for the rest of their lives.